Hello and welcome everyone to our third webinar on the process we use for selling your business. Today we're going to cover the closing phase. My name is Eric Gall. I'm the broker for Edison Business Advisors, and I'm joined today by my two colleagues, Michael Pfeffer and Steve Niehaus. We are experts in helping business owners and aspiring business owners execute the process of buying and selling businesses. Our contact information is presented here, but it'll be presented again on the last slide in today's webinar, just in case you don't have time to write it down. Again, today's webinar will concern the closing phase of the business sale process. This is the phase from handling inquiries through the closing of the deal and beyond. If you'd like to watch the first two webinars in this three-part series, you can find them on our webpage under the blog tab. A direct URL is also provided on this slide at the bottom, as you can see. I'll start with a quick recap of the three webinars. The first webinar covered the planning phase. This includes the documents we use to collect, to initiate the process of completing a financial recast for the business, to produce a valuation of the business and the expected price it'll command in the marketplace. The second webinar covered the marketing phase. This includes the listing agreements we use, documents and language we use to prepare advertisements, teasers, and the confidential business reviews, and where and how we advertise and promote the businesses we have for sale. Today's webinar focuses on the closing phase. Basically, this covers handling inquiries, how they come in, what documents are required, and how we strive to retain the utmost confidentiality during this part of the process. We cover offer types, the due diligence process, and the financing options that a seller may be forced to choose from. And finally, we cover the closing itself, how to prepare for the closing meeting, and what happens post-closing. With this, I'll turn it over to Mike, and he'll discuss how we handle inquiries. Mike?
Thanks, Eric. As everybody learned from our second webinar, we expose a business to a wide range of venues, but most of the inquiries come in from just a few of those, mostly BizQuest, but they also come from these other websites that you might see here. And it might depend on the size of the deal. But we also get inquiries from other brokers. As you know, we have an MLS system in Florida just for businesses, the Business Brokers of Florida MLS system. And we get a lot of inquiries from other brokers as well. And we also maintain a list of buyers that have been interested in the past in certain businesses, and we've built this database over a number of years, so we kind of have a feel for what the buyers are looking for. And again, I'll reiterate that our primary concern is the confidentiality, so we can protect the seller, and it helps us to avoid the tire kickers and the guys with two nickels to rub together. Yeah, carry on, that's good. So here's our standard non-disclosure agreement. When an inquiry comes in, the first thing we do is qualify the buyer. So they sign a non-disclosure agreement, and once we get that back, we can either send them the CBR, the Confidential Business Review, or another teaser that might explain a little bit more than the original. And we also request more information about the buyer. We want some financial capabilities and also want to find out more about that buyer. And that may entail a phone call as well, but we like to have them fill out a form that helps us understand their background, both from a business perspective and from their skill set. And also we can check their credit rating if need be, but typically we will rely on that personal financial statement. It's really to identify that seller. So what are some of the key elements of that document? General information, we identify the business, the contact information for the buyer and seller, and what are the terms and conditions. So the length of the commitment. Typically when we get that NDA, that non-disclosure agreement, it's in effect for 2 years. So if somebody comes and tries to go around us and buy that business, then typically we're gonna look into that and get paid one way or another. We also go over closely with the seller to determine what information should be revealed or could be revealed early and what needs to be held back until an offer is made and accepted and we get into the due diligence. It also outlines what happens if either party breaches the agreement and what's the governing law which is Florida law, but it may be in a separate county, Lee or Collier or another county. Most businesses, closely held businesses that sell are asset sales. And that's usually because people are afraid of contingent liabilities. What's a contingent liability? It could be somebody had a slip and fall a year ago and then never reported it, and it may stick with the business, even though there are some clauses that go into the purchase agreements to try to protect from that. We usually stick with an asset sale. There are certain instances where we might have a stock sale. For instance, if there's a company that has a lot of rolling stock, like a trucking company or a taxi cab or a car lease company, where it would be cost prohibitive to try to get all of those titles transferred, then we may go with the stock purchase. Technically, a stock purchase is regulated by the SEC, although there is some legislation in Congress right now. It looks like it's probably going to pass. And what that will do is allow the commission to overlook transactions of closely held businesses that are performed through intermediaries for businesses under 250 million in sales and 25 million in earnings. So we typically don't deal in businesses quite that size, maybe later. So we don't worry about that. And we do have a process how we can actually convert an asset sale to a stock sale if it's necessary. Due diligence is a period of time and a process where the buyer has the ability to verify the information that's been presented and the information that has not been presented yet. They can take a week or two, or it could be months if it was a larger transaction. I would say typically it's about 2 to 4 weeks. One of the other provisions is the financing. And in most business sales these days, there is some financing involved. Most buyers won't pay cash for a business. It does happen, but it lowers their return on their investment. So for instance, if I had $100,000, would I buy a $100,000 business that spins off 30,000, or would I take that 100,000, go to the bank, borrow $1 million, and buy a business that spins off $1 million and give myself 100% return on my investment, cash on cash? So there's typically financing involved, and it may include financing by the seller, or it could be from Aunt Maud and Uncle Chuck or somebody else. It's usually a combination. If somebody goes to the bank and gets an SBA guaranteed loan, usually they're going to want a down payment from the buyer, and they're going to want that guaranteed loan from the bank, but they're also going to want the seller to hold the note as well. And it's usually somewhere between 10 and 20%. So the offers, and I'm going to back up just a little bit and talk a little bit more about the assets, because we're talking mostly about asset sales. So what are those assets? We have two kinds of assets that are under consideration. The tangible assets, and this includes things like the furniture and the fixtures and the equipment and the inventory and leasehold improvements or the build out of the facility. And it may even include cash in the form of working capital. What often is overlooked or less understood are the intangible assets and the value that they provide. And intangible means we can't really hold it in our hand, but it might be something like a trade name or customer list or phone numbers, or maybe the logo or trademark or service mark. It could be engineering drawings, computer code or programs. It could be processes, formulas, other programs, employee manuals, for instance, or it could simply be your workforce in place or technical expertise. Also, goodwill is included in that, and goodwill is the likelihood that somebody is going to come back and do business with that business again. So those are the different kinds of assets that are typically under consideration and need to be reviewed. So offers, when we get an offer in, it's kind of like a house. Most offers come in at about 10% under the asking price, and we take that into consideration when we're pricing a business. It's nearly always asset, as I mentioned earlier, because of the contingent liabilities. So we then go into the due diligence process. Again, that's verifying all that information that was provided, and the financing that we already talked about, that may be one or up to 3 or 4 different sources of financing. So when the offer comes in, there are certain things that the seller has to consider. Number one, how long do they have to decide whether or not to accept, reject, or counter that offer? We usually have in there who would be the closing and the escrow attorney. The terms of the financing in the due diligence period, how long you have to actually do the due diligence is included in there as well. How long to inspect those assets, and other terms of the offer, which may include how long the seller is going to help transition the business to the new owner, and a non-compete, which says that the seller will not compete with the buyer for usually for a period of years, 2 or 3 years, and it's usually 20 to 50 miles, something like that, so it remains enforceable. Again, just a review of some of the items that are in the agreement. You can kind of read these yourself. What happens if somebody backs out? How long it's going to take to familiarize the new owner with the business? Some of these things are actually taken care of by the closing attorney, for instance, prorations, which means who's responsible for what as of the closing date, and that could include insurance, it could include utility bills, it could be obligations under a contract with either a supplier or a customer, and those are usually calculated by the attorney. And one of the key elements is the lease, whether or not it's going to be a new lease for the new owner or whether it's going to be an assumption of the old lease. So it's critical to get the landlord involved at some point during that due diligence process. Some of the other things to take into consideration that I think Steve is going to cover, but any of the licenses, whatever's required to operate that business. Steve?
Okay, so jumping into due diligence, so as Michael said, we have an agreement. The buyer and seller have agreed, and now it's time for the buyer to get into the due diligence phase, which if the homework was done up front and you had a good business broker like Eric, Michael, or myself, you would have all the proper financial statements and information presented. So when the buyer is looking at that, they're gonna do a deep dive and say, okay, here's what you told me the business is earning. Here's what let's dig in and see. And all we're really doing is just validating what's been presented. But I will tell you from experience, what the financial statements or what another business broker or seller may present as their discretionary earnings, it does require sometimes a little fine tuning to understand fully and validate that, because there are some personal expenses and things that could be questionable. But we dig into the contracts that are out there, both from the customer side. If you said I have 300 customers under contract, we'll look at the customer data, and then we'll look at vendor. If we have vendor special agreements, we'll look at those. And then understanding if it's part of the transaction to dig in and understand what liabilities are transferring or what potential liabilities are still out there. If we purchase inventory and still to be billed, we want to make sure there's no surprises. And then as Michael said, most of what we're talking about is assets. The assets are the tangible, which is the furniture, fixture, equipment, inventory, if it's vehicles, things like that, just to make sure what we're buying is as stated in the asset list. And then the websites, the URLs, the Facebooks, the LinkedIns, the phone numbers. We just want to make sure we have a full view of everything we're acquiring. And then the corporate status. So while the buyer may set up his own entity, his or her own entity, they will look and see how did the business run before, and is there should they structure it similar to the prior owners, just to make sure things are continue. And then we get into the operations. Let's look at the documentation on the systems and procedures, policies. And a very important part of this is the employees. Understanding, the employees who are going to stay with the business, and making sure there's no employees who are either family members or are beholden to the owner who are going to leave. So we got to make sure we understand and validate that. In a recent example for employees is there's a couple key employees in a transaction, so we could do retention agreements, which we just did with a recent transaction. So just making sure we understand that the continuity of the business is critical. That's what we're buying. And then looking at how they're marketing, what their approach to marketing is, understand the insurance, and licenses and permits, as Michael mentioned. If we're buying a business that requires a license, as for example an HVAC company, we got to understand how is that going to be transferred. Is the buyer qualified, or is there going to be a way to qualify that buyer going forward? Another one that needs to be addressed is the lease, making sure that the landlord is in support of transferring or reassigning that lease to the new buyer. So we have to make sure that there's no surprises there as well. So once we get through due diligence, then or concurrently, really, we're looking at financing. And Michael mentioned, the bank financing or seller financing. Bank financing, a lot of the deals will be SBA. The 7A loans are a very common one you see in the SBA portfolio, if you will. When you do bank financing, you're leveraging, as we said, you're leveraging the purchase, so that could command a higher price versus a cash purchase. A typical SBA loan without real estate is 10 years. Once you have real estate involved, some of the loans with real estate can go to 25 years. So if you're buying a business and real estate, you'll get a blended, a longer term. And with bank financing, the bank's in the first position, meaning that if there's any subsequent financing with the seller be in second position. In the down payment required, the money up front, generally 10%, 15%, depending on the strength of the buyer, the bank will determine, what the required down payment is. Which segues into the next one, may require seller financing. So the seller financing could be, a small percent, 5, 10%, or it could be the whole transaction, depending on the seller. If they're in a position to where they can finance the purchase, they're going to get a much higher price for the business because they're basically they're keeping some skin in the game. You're going to generally see a shorter term than you would with bank financing. And both of them require a security agreement, so the buyer really has to be committed to that purchase with a personal guarantee. Again, the seller will be in second position to the bank, meaning if there's a default, the bank's going to be paid first, and then the seller. But seller financing, especially in this COVID period, and where we're seeing some we'll call them distressed businesses. Seller financing could be a more common proposition for some businesses to be able to make that transaction happen. And so we get our financing taken care of, we have our due diligence taken care of, then we get into the closing process. Pre-closing, some of those things are on the due diligence and financing, but then there's a lot of things we need to start setting up as far as our legal structure, what our corporate entity is going to be. There's a series of items that we work through with the buyer and the seller. Then we have the closing meeting with a closing attorney generally. There's a couple key attorneys that are very familiar with this process, so that helps make the process go a lot smoother. And then post-closing, the transition items could be quite extensive depending on the nature of the business. So let's look at pre-closing as an example. We have the contingencies to make sure we pass due diligence, make sure we have the financing secured, make sure the landlord's good with things. If it is a franchise, make sure we get that approved. We go through any inspections. If it's if we're buying vehicles and equipment or property, obviously inspections are going to be critical. We talked about the entity setup. In vehicle titles, this is what Michael mentioned earlier. If there's, if you're buying a car rental company with fleet, transitioning all the vehicle titles is quite extensive. So you may look at a stock purchase versus the asset. Then we get in all the utilities, which means electrical, water, the website, cable, all those things. We have to coordinate between buyer and seller, and then provide the wire instructions, which. We should put a red flag on this one because there's been so much fraud recently. So making sure we carefully execute all transactions as far as wiring funds to the closing agents. And then during closing, there's a third-party attorney that's involved. the attorney and their paralegal team will prepare all the documents necessary, the settlement statement, bill of sale, the non-compete clause, which again, if you're selling the business, you're going to make certain that the seller, or excuse me, if you're buying the business, you make certain that the seller is not going to be competing with you. So we have non-compete agreements. We may have employment agreements with key employees. And then the most important part is dispersing the funds for the seller to either retire or venture into whatever his or her next objective is. And then it's time to celebrate. So we have a closing. We have a nice, hopefully a good cordial relationship. The teams are going to work together on a transition period, which generally the transition period, again, it's all negotiable, but 1 to 4 weeks, depending on the complexity of the business. Longer if necessary, if it's more intense. But this is a training period, not an employment. And so the seller, and with the SBA loans, the seller cannot be an employee of the new entity. So there's a period of time. So it's not an employment agreement. It'll be a transition process. And then we as brokers, support along. And there's things outside of the common, which we have a network of relationships, with website companies, bankers, you name it, as far as supporting the transition. So we just don't evaporate. We still help through the process. And so in summary, we talked about the 9 steps. The first is making sure that the business is a sellable business, doing the financial recast, validating what the valuation is, then getting agreement and then listing that, marketing that, preparing all the documentation and advertising and marketing, handling those buyers, which we just talked about today. So the inquiries, and then going through the offer, due diligence, financing, and then closing. So that's the 9 steps. Sounds simple, but quite honestly, it's quite involved in the length of time to sell a business, as we see from some of the facts here. On average, which is risky to talk about averages, but on average it takes 9 months to sell a business. So the more work we do up front, the better we can do on streamlining the whole process from due diligence to financing, etc. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Eric.
Eric, I just wanted to make one quick comment here. Steve, you mentioned about the seller financing. I can't emphasize enough how important that can be to a seller. It can shorten the time period. It's particularly in this environment where it may or may not be easy to get bank financing depending upon where you are. But the key is it also opens up the buyer pool to a lot more potential buyers. I know nobody wants to hold paper. Nobody wants to finance their deal, but there are so many benefits. For instance, you can charge an interest rate that's well above what you might earn in a bank. And again, it opens up that buyer pool to a lot more potential buyers, and you can ask more for the business. So I think that's really important for sellers to consider.
No question about it. Did we get any questions in? I mean, I saw one on how long does it take to get financing through an SBA lender? How long does that process take?
Well, I should have mentioned this when I talked about the SBA, because right now, because of the coronavirus situation, as you know, the CARES Act and a few other government stimulus programs have been put in place. But one big one is the SBA financing. If a buyer secures an SBA loan by September 27th, the SBA, meaning the government, the Small Business Administration, will pay for the principal and interest for that loan for 6 months. Not defer it, but pay it for 6 months. So if you think about a 10-year loan, that's a 5% pay cut, or price cut, if you will. So that's critical. As far as timing, it's you've seen deals close within 30 days. Some take 90 days. It all depends on the quality of the business and the business records, as well as the buyer and the buyer's records as far as their tax returns, their credit worthiness, etc. So, Michael or Eric, you can expand on, any recent experiences you may have had.
I'll make one comment. We have SBA lenders at our disposal that we've done deals with, and we pretty much know all the good ones and we know the bad ones. Typically, you know, the smaller banks where where we're working directly with someone who pitches the loan to the loan committee, and there's not 6, 7 layers of people between, you know, the person we're working with and the person who pitches that loan. If we're working with someone who has direct access to that loan committee, we find that, you know, you can get a deal done in 30 to 45 days. You know, the larger banks, you know, they tend to have a lot of people involved and a lot of moving parts. And I've seen instances where, you know, those deals take, you know, up to 90 days just because miscommunication, you know, between the, you know, the cogs and the wheels and the bigger machines. So, you know, I can't stress enough, listen to us, listen to our advice in using lenders, and we can save you a lot of time.
And the other thing to keep in mind is that although the SBA has their operating rules, that each bank has theirs as well. I have a deal that's going to close in July with an out-of-state buyer that went to 25 banks that turned him down. And we finally found one that would do the deal. So you have to be open-minded, and it may not be your banker that you're familiar with because he's not on the loan committee. But as Eric mentioned, we have a lot of resources. We've been in this business a long time. So we can usually find the deal that'll get done if it's possible.
I've got another question on transition versus employment. What if there's, you know, the business is very complicated and it needs an extended period? You know, do I have to, you know, work for free for a long or extended period of time?
Yeah, SBA will allow the seller to work for the business for up to 1 year, but no longer. So I have a case right now where the seller will work for nothing for 4 weeks and then is actually going to be on a consulting agreement for up to 1 year.
That's another reason why you might consider seller financing as well, because you won't have that SBA requirement if it's something where you want to stay involved in the business for 2 to 3 to 4, 5, even 5 years to make sure it's successful and the buyer is successful.
And to make sure you get paid.
Yeah, and you can take some of your payment in the form of paychecks.
Yeah, and sometimes just carrying the license, you know, if you're, you know, qualifying the business with your license until that person gets their own license or comes up with another plan. Okay, Eric, you want to close us up?
Yeah, I don't see any more questions. So, you know, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And if you're watching this on instant replay, you know, we welcome you too as well. And, you know, if you have any questions about this part of the process or any of the other 2 webinars or anything in general related to buying or selling a business, you know, here's our contact information. You know, we're readily available to help you, you know, pursue your dreams of either exiting your business and moving on in life or, you know, making that acquisition of a business and, you know, fulfilling your dream that way. So again, on behalf of Eric, Michael, and Stephen, you know, thank you for your time. And again, we're a resource to you and here to help you when you need us.